How is it possible that a humble Lebanese monk who spent the last 23 years of his life locked away in a hermitage, in absolute silence and the strictest poverty, without writing books, founding orders, or preaching to the masses, has become one of the most beloved and miraculous saints in the entire church, invoked today by millions of people around the world, both Christians and Muslims? Saint Charbel Makhlouf never sought fame. He sought only God, in the hiddenness of a stone cell among the cedars of Lebanon. Yet, from his tomb, it is said that more than 30,000 graces and healings have emerged, to the point that the people tenderly call him the Doctor of Heaven. His body, found incorrupt and bathed in a mysterious liquid for decades, astonished the world, and his appearances and miracles continue to occur in our own days. Join me on this journey through his hidden life, his glorious death, and his astonishing miracles, to discover why this saint of silence still speaks so powerfully to the hearts of men today. Chapter 1. The Lebanon of Cedars, Land of Saints. To understand Saint Charbel, we must first look at the land that saw him born. Lebanon, that small country of Christian East, perched between the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains, renowned since ancient times for its majestic cedars. Sacred scripture already sings the glory of the cedars of Lebanon, a symbol of strength, nobility, and permanence. Psalm 91 compares the righteous to the cedar of Lebanon that flourishes in the house of the Lord, and King Solomon used its precious wood to build the Temple of Jerusalem. That land, therefore, was blessed from ancient times. Lebanon is a land of high mountains and deep valleys, of winter snows and bright summers, of villages clinging to the slopes and monasteries hidden among the rocks. In those heights, far from the bustle of the world, life has preserved an ancient rhythm for centuries, marked by the work of the land, prayer, and the traditions of faith. It is a geography that invites reflection, where the silence of the peaks seems to lift the soul towards God. It is no wonder that such a land has been the cradle of saints and hermits. Since the early centuries of Christianity, Lebanon was a refuge for monks and anchorites who sought God in the solitude of its mountains. The caves and valleys became populated with hermits who, following the example of the ancient monks of the deserts of Egypt and Syria, withdrew from the world to live in prayer and penance. This eremitic tradition, so ancient and venerable, has remained alive throughout the centuries, and in it would form, over time, the soul of Saint Charbel. His life was not a novelty, but the blossoming of a holy heritage that preceded it. The people of Lebanon, and particularly the Maronite Christian community to which Charbel belonged, preserved their faith with admirable tenacity, often amid difficulties, persecutions, and hardships. Surrounded by other peoples and religions, the Christians of Lebanon maintained their identity and their communion with the Church of Rome, cherishing as a treasure the faith received from their ancestors. This fidelity, forged in trial, made Lebanon a land of testimony and martyrdom, where faith was not a superficial custom, but a conviction rooted deep in the heart. Contemplating the Lebanon of cedars helps us understand the spiritual soil in which the holiness of Charbel germinated. It did not arise from nothing, but from a land steeped in faith, a centuries-old monastic tradition, and a faithful people who loved God. Just as the cedar sinks its roots into the rock of the mountain to grow strong and rise towards the sky, so did Charbel sink the roots of his soul in the faith of his people to ascend to the heights of holiness. And in the heart of that land beats an ancient story, that of a holy monk from whom an entire church takes its name, Saint Maron. Chapter 2. Saint Maron and the Maronite Church, Ancient Roots. Saint Charbel belonged to the Maronite Church, one of the venerable Catholic churches of the East, which preserves its own rite, traditions, and liturgical language, and is in full communion with the Pope of Rome. To understand Charbel, it is necessary to know, at least briefly, the roots of this church, which trace their origin back to the early centuries of Christianity. The Maronite Church takes its name from Saint Maron, a holy monk and hermit who lived in Syria at the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th. Saint Maron was a solitary figure who withdrew to live high on a mountain, devoted to prayer, penance and contemplation, outdoors under the sky, in admirable austerity. His reputation for holiness and the miracles that God worked through his intercession attracted numerous disciples who wished to imitate his way of life. Around his figure, a spiritual and monastic movement formed that over time would give rise to a whole community of believers, the Maronites, who took him as their father and patron. From that humble hermit, an entire church was born. The Maronites, throughout the centuries, have been characterized by their unwavering fidelity to the Catholic faith and to communion with the See of St. Peter in Rome. Primarily established in the mountains of Lebanon, they maintained their faith amidst often adverse circumstances, enduring persecution while always preserving their Christian identity. Their history is one of fidelity and resistance, of love for Christ and his church, which made them a deeply believing people attached to their monasteries, their liturgies, and their ancestral traditions. Maronite spirituality, heir to Saint Maron and the ancient monks of the East, grants a central place to monastic life, asceticism, liturgical prayer, and devotion to the Eucharist and the Virgin Mary. The ideal of the hermit, who leaves everything behind to seek God in solitude, holds an honored place in this tradition. Saint Charbel would be, in a sense, the perfect embodiment of this Maronite ideal, the most beautiful flowering of a spirituality that came from far away. In him, the ancient heritage of Saint Maron would yield one of its most admirable fruits. Understanding the Maronite roots of Saint Charbel helps us to place him in his proper context. He was not an isolated saint, nor a strange phenomenon, but a faithful heir to a millennia-old spiritual tradition which he brought to its fullness. When we contemplate Charbel praying in his hermitage, devoted to silence and penance, we are witnessing the revival of the spirit of Saint Maron and the ancient monks of Lebanon. The Maronite Church can rightly consider him one of its most glorious sons, in whom the beauty of its heritage shines, and that holy heritage would take root in a specific place, a small village lost high in the mountains. Chapter 3. Bekar Kafra, the highest village in Lebanon. Saint Charbel was born in Bekar Kafra, a small village situated at the highest point of the northern Lebanese mountains, considered the highest inhabited population in the entire country. Nestled among the peaks, near the famous forest of ancient cedars, Bekar Kafra was a humble and secluded place, with simple stone houses inhabited by poor and hard-working people who lived off the cultivation of the land and the care of their flocks. In that remote corner, far from the cities and their vanities, the future saint came into the world. The height and ruggedness of the place had forged a strong and simple character in its inhabitants, accustomed to the harshness of mountain life, to the severe winters and to constant work. But alongside this toughness, the people of Bekar Kafra maintained a deep and simple faith, passed down from generation to generation. Life flowed in rhythm with the seasons and religious celebrations, between the work of the fields and prayer in the humble village church. It was an environment poor in material goods, but rich in faith and Christian virtues. It is significant that God chose such a humble and hidden place to bring forth one of his great saints. As in many instances throughout the history of salvation, the Lord focuses on the small and the despised in the eyes of the world to perform his wonders. Just as he chose the insignificant village of Bethlehem for the birth of his son, or the small Nazareth for his hidden life, he chose the remote Bekar Kafra to give the world Saint Charbel. The greatness of God is manifested in the smallness of the places and people he chooses. That mountain village, with its horizon of peaks and cedars, undoubtedly left its mark on the soul of the future hermit. The silence of the heights, the contemplation of nature, the closeness to heaven, the simple and diligent life. All of these in some way prepared the child's heart for the vocation that God had reserved for him. Those who grow up among mountains soon learn to lift their gaze, and those who live in poverty learn not to cling to the things of the earth. Bekar Kafra was the first school, silent and natural, of the Saint of Silence. Today, Bekar Kafra is a pilgrimage destination, and the faithful come to venerate the place where Saint Charbel was born, keeping the memory of his humble origins alive. That previously unknown village has become famous worldwide thanks to its most illustrious son. It is beautiful to consider how a saint can bring glory and renown to his homeland, not through wealth or power, but through holiness. From that humble cradle would come a man whose fame would fill the earth. But before becoming a saint, Charbel was a child, and now we should turn our attention to the beginnings of his life. Chapter 4. Birth of Youssef Makhlouf. The future Saint Charbel was born on May 8, 1828, into a humble and deeply Christian family in Bekar Kafra. At his baptism, he received the name Youssef, which is the Arabic form of Joseph, thus placing himself under the protection of the Holy Patriarch Joseph, spouse of the Virgin Mary and model of a hidden and silent life. The name would prove prophetic, for like Saint Joseph, Youssef would live a humble and quiet existence, entirely devoted to God in silence. His parents, Antun Makhlouf and Brigida, were poor but pious farmers who earned their bread through the work of their hands and raised their children in the fear of God. Youssef was the youngest of several siblings and grew up in a home where faith was not an ornament, but the very air they breathed. From the cradle, he learned to pray, to participate in the celebrations of the church, and to live according to God's commandments. The poverty of the household was not an obstacle, but rather a fertile ground for the Christian virtues of simplicity, hard work, and trust in providence. However, a shadow of sorrow marked the early years of Youssef. As a young child, at just 3 years old, he lost his father, Antun, who died prematurely while performing forced labor. The little boy became fatherless at an incredibly young age and had to grow up without a paternal figure. This early loss, far from souring his heart, seems to have opened it even more to the search for God, the father of orphans and protector of the weak, as sung in Psalm 67. Youssef's mother, a widow with several children to raise, later remarried a pious man who, over time, would receive holy orders and become the village priest, in accordance with the Eastern Church's custom of allowing married men to be priests. Thus, the environment surrounding young Youssef was even more infused with religiosity, as his own stepfather was engaged in sacred ministry. The house thus became a small sanctuary where faith was lived intensely every day. The birth and early years of Youssef Makhlouf show us the humble beginnings of a great saint. There was nothing extraordinary in the eyes of the world about that poor orphaned child from a remote village. Yet God had placed a seed of holiness in his heart from the very beginning, which would grow quietly. Like the cedar that starts as a small seed hidden in the ground, the future Saint Charbel began his life in humility and obscurity. Soon, the first signs of a singular vocation would manifest in his years of pastoral childhood. Chapter 5. A childhood marked by orphanhood and faith. That humble occupation, far from being a wasted time, became for him a true school of prayer and contemplation. In the solitude of the mountains, the young shepherd learned to converse with God and to savor silence. Tradition has preserved the memory that Youssef, while tending the flock, would retreat to pray in a nearby cave, where he placed an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. There, in that cave-turned oratory, the boy spent long periods in prayer, kneeling before the image of the Mother of God, away from everyone, absorbed in communion with heaven. That cave was like the first sanctuary of his spiritual life, the place where his soul was tempered in intimacy with God and with the Virgin. This detail of the cave and of the image of Mary is of great beauty, as it already foreshadows the entire future life of the saint. The one who, as a child, sought the solitude of the cave to pray, would, as an adult, be the hermit who would retreat to a cell to live fully united to God. The devotion to the Virgin Mary, which he nurtured from childhood before that image, would accompany him throughout his life and be one of the pillars of his holiness. In the shepherd boy of Bekar Kafra was already in seed the great contemplative of Anaya. The simple and solitary life of the shepherd favored in Yusef the recollection and union with God. Gazing at the grandeur of the mountains, the beauty of the cedars, and the vastness of the starry sky, his soul naturally soared towards the Creator of all those wonders. Like the young David, who was a shepherd before becoming king, and learned to praise God with his psalms in the fields, so Yusef learned in the mountain pastures the art of prayer and praise. Nature was for him an open book that spoke of God. The episode of the shepherd boy and the prayer cave reveals the contemplative root of Saint Charbel's vocation. Long before entering the monastery, he already lived in his way like a little hermit, seeking God in solitude and silence. That inclination, nurtured in childhood, would grow until culminating in the decision to fully dedicate himself to the Lord in religious life. Thus, the years of pastoral childhood were the distant preparation for his great vocation. In this preparation, the example of his hermit uncles played a decisive role. Chapter 7. The Hermit Uncles and the Inner Calling. Among the influences that awakened and strengthened Yusef's vocation, the example of two of his maternal uncles, who had dedicated themselves to God as hermit monks, stood out. Those relatives had left the world to retreat into solitude, in monasteries and hermitages, where they lived devoted to prayer, penance, and work. Thus began his monastic life, in which he would receive a new name and a new existence entirely devoted to the Lord. Chapter 9. The Monastery of Our Lady of Maifuk. Yusef's first destination in his new life was the Monastery of Our Lady of Maifuk, where he began his novitiate, that is, the period of initiation and testing in religious life. There, under the protection of the Most Holy Virgin, to whom the monastery was dedicated, the young man took his first steps in monastic life, learning its rules, customs, and spirit. It was the beginning of a new existence, where everything was oriented towards the search for God and self-denial. In Maifuk, Yusef fervently dedicated himself to the life of prayer, silence, and the discipline characteristic of the novitiate. He learned to pray according to monastic tradition, to participate in the liturgy, to practice obedience and humility, and to overcome his own will, to align it with that of God and his superiors. The novitiate is a time of purification and formation, in which the soul sheds the habits of the world and is clothed with the Spirit of Christ. Yusef experienced it with the seriousness and fervor of one who knows what he seeks. That this first monastery was dedicated to Our Lady holds deep significance in Charbel's life. The devotion to the Virgin Mary, which he had cultivated since childhood before the image of the cave, now found new nourishment in that Marian sanctuary. Under the protection of the Mother of God, his path of consecration began. Mary, who had guided his first steps toward God, now welcomed him at the threshold of religious life, like a mother introducing her son into the house of the Lord. Those early days of religious life were not without difficulties and trials, as is often the case at the beginning of any path to perfection. The young novice had to struggle against himself, against the nostalgia for the home left behind, against the harshness of common life and discipline. But his determination was firm, and his love for God stronger than any difficulty. With the help of grace, he overcame the initial trials and strengthened his vocation. Each obstacle he overcame fortified his resolve to consecrate himself entirely to the Lord. Yusef's time at the monastery of Our Lady of Maifuk was the threshold of his religious life, the place where he began to lay the foundations of his holiness. But the Lord called him to a particular monastery, where he would spend most of his life and where he would receive the name by which he would be known in history, the monastery of Saint Maron in Anaya. He would soon head there to fully embrace monastic life and pronounce his solemn vows. There the true story of Saint Charbel would begin. Chapter 10. The monastery of Saint Maron in Anaya, and the name of Charbel. From Maifuk, Yusef moved to the monastery of Saint Maron, located in the town of Anaya in the mountains of Lebanon, which would become the center of his religious life and the place most closely associated with his memory. There, in that cenobium dedicated to the father of the Maronites, Yusef definitively embraced monastic life and prepared to pronounce his solemn vows. The Anaya monastery, with its church, cells and farmland, would be his home for many years, and from there his soul would ascend to the heights of holiness. Upon entering monastic life, in accordance with tradition, Yusef changed his baptismal name to a religious name, a sign of the new life he was beginning and the new man he was becoming. He chose the name Charbel, in honor of an early Christian martyr from the first centuries, who was martyred in the city of Antioch for his faith in Christ. By taking this name, Yusef expressed his desire to imitate that martyr in his love for Christ and his willingness to give everything for him. The name Charbel, until then little known, would become famous worldwide. The choice of a martyr's name was significant. Although Charbel would not shed his blood in a bloody martyrdom, he would live an unbloody martyrdom, marked by daily self-denial, penance, silence, and total surrender to God throughout his life. Monastic life, lived with radical dedication, is in a sense a prolonged martyrdom, a daily death to the world and to one's own passions for the love of Christ. In this sense, the name Charbel would prove prophetic. He would be a martyr of God's love in the silence of the hermitage. At the monastery of Saint Maron in Anaya, Charbel devoted himself entirely to religious life. He stood out among his brothers for his fervor, humility, obedience, and love of prayer. He meticulously adhered to all the observances of the rule, always sought the most humble tasks, and avoided standing out or drawing attention to himself. His only desire was to please God and grow in his love, without seeking the approval of men. That young monk went unnoticed in the eyes of the world, but shone in the eyes of God for the purity of his dedication. Charbel's entry into the Anaya monastery and the adoption of his new name mark the full beginning of his consecrated life. There, in that cenobium of the mountains of Lebanon, the sanctity of the great hermit would be forged. The shepherd boy from Bekar Kafra, the young man who had left the world, was now becoming the monk Charbel, wholly dedicated to God. A new stage of his life began, one of definitive surrender, sealed shortly thereafter with his solemn vows. And those vows, pronounced before God and the community, would bind him forever to the Lord he had chosen to serve. Chapter 11. The Solemn Vows. After the period of trial and formation in the novitiate, Charbel prepared for the culminating moment of his consecration, the profession of solemn vows by which he would commit himself to God definitively and irrevocably. The vows were not for him a destination, but a starting point towards an ever fuller surrender. Charbel's solemn profession is a decisive moment in his path to holiness. With it, he dedicated himself to God without reservation and with no turning back, ready to follow Christ along the narrow path of the evangelical counsels. Those vows would be the foundation upon which his entire monastic and hermitic life would be built. Faithful to them until his last breath, Charbel would demonstrate that radical dedication to God leads to the heights of holiness. Already consecrated by his vows, he would then prepare to receive the sacrament of holy orders and become a priest after a period of studies. Chapter 12. Studies in Cfifan and Saint Nimatullah al-Hardini. To prepare for the priesthood, Charbel had to complete his studies in philosophy and theology, which he undertook at the monastery of Cfifan, another important center of Maronite monastic life. There, for several years, he devoted himself to the study of sacred sciences, learning the doctrine of the Church, sacred scripture, theology, and everything necessary for the exercise of the priestly ministry. Thus he united his intense life of prayer and penance with the intellectual formation typical of someone preparing to serve at the altar. During those years of study, Charbel was fortunate to have among his teachers and companions men of great holiness. Among them, Saint Nimatullah al-Hardini stands out as a particularly significant figure, another great saint of the Maronite Church, an exemplary monk and master of spiritual life, who served as a guide and model for young Charbel. Providence arranged for a saint to be formed alongside another saint, allowing the flame of holiness to be passed from teacher to disciple. The example and teachings of Hardini left a deep mark on Charbel's soul. Saint Nimatullah al-Hardini was known for his love of the Eucharist, his life of prayer and penance, and his exquisite fidelity to monastic rules. In him, Charbel found a living model of the holy monk he aspired to resemble. He learned from his master the love of hidden life, devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, fidelity to observances, and zeal for perfection. That two saints canonized by the Church coincided in the same monastery as teacher and disciple is a telling sign of the spiritual fertility of that monastic tradition. During these years of study, Charbel never neglected his life of prayer or penance. Rather, he combined intellectual work with contemplation. His demeanor was kind and simple, yet reserved, as he loved silence and avoided pointless conversations. He lived among his brothers like an angel of peace and contemplation. Those who lived with Charbel during those years later testified to his extraordinary virtue. They recalled his fidelity to the rule, his love of prayer, his penance, his purity, and his charity. Nothing about him attracted attention for being spectacular, but everything revealed a man completely devoted to God. His holiness was that of perfect fulfillment of ordinary duty, of faithfulness in the small things of each day. Precisely for this reason, it was a solid and true holiness, forged in perseverance and not in fleeting enthusiasm. The 16 years of communal life were for Charbel the immediate preparation for the eremitic life that God had reserved for him. In the community, he learned obedience, humility, and fidelity, virtues that he would later carry into the solitude of the hermitage. The cenobitic life was the foundation upon which his solitary life would be built, for no one can live rightly in solitude if they have not first learned to live in community. When he had been sufficiently tested and matured, Charbel would finally receive permission to withdraw to the hermitage and would begin the highest and most hidden stage of his life. Chapter 15. The Call to the Desert, the Hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul. After many long years of faithful communal life, Charbel felt strongly the call of God to an even more radical commitment, that of the eremitic life, in solitude, silence, and penance. The life of the hermit was considered in monastic tradition to be the highest and most demanding peak of consecrated life, reserved only for souls already tested and mature in virtue. Charbel, who had loved solitude and prayer since childhood, longed to withdraw entirely to live alone with God. In the year 1875, after demonstrating his fidelity and virtue for many years, Charbel finally obtained from his superiors the permission to retire to the eremitic life. He was granted the opportunity to inhabit the hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul, located near the monastery of Anaya in a solitary setting of the mountain. There, In that humble hermitage, Charbel would spend the last 23 years of his life in strict solitude, completely devoted to prayer and penance. The permission for eremitic life was not granted easily, as the church and religious orders were aware of the dangers of solitude for those who were not well prepared. Isolation can be a source of deception and downfall for weak or presumptuous souls. Therefore, it was only allowed for monks of proven virtue, capable of bearing the weight of solitude without faltering. That Charbel was granted this permission is a testament to the trust his superiors had in his holiness and spiritual maturity. He had been deemed worthy of the highest life. Tradition holds that Charbel's eremitic vocation was confirmed by a sign. It is said that on the eve of his departure to the hermitage, he was tasked with preparing the altar lamp, and a brother, to test him, filled the lamp with water instead of oil. However, the lamp miraculously burned, a sign that God approved and blessed Charbel's new path. This prodigy, which we will discuss in more detail later, was taken as confirmation that God's will was for Charbel to retreat into solitude. The call to the desert, that is, to eremitic life, marks the beginning of the culminating stage of Saint Charbel's life. Like the ancient desert fathers, including Saint Maron himself, Charbel withdrew to solitude to seek God without any distractions, engaged in a spiritual battle sustained by prayer and penance. That hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul would be the stage of his highest holiness, the place where his soul would unite with God in an increasingly intimate way. The hidden life of the great hermit of Lebanon began, characterized by silence, solitude, and incessant prayer. Chapter 16. The Rule of Silence and Solitude. Charbel's life in the hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul was marked above all by silence and solitude, which he embraced not as deprivation, but as the conducive environment for meeting God. In the hermitage, away from dealings with men, Charbel could devote himself without distraction to prayer and contemplation, listening in the silence to the voice of God that speaks to the heart. The outer silence fostered in him an inner silence, that stilling of passions and the noise of the soul that allows one to hear God. Charbel maintained a rigorous silence, speaking only what was strictly necessary and avoiding all useless conversation. He knew that superfluous words dissipate the soul and lead one away from God, while silence gathers and elevates it. He did not seek pleasure in food, but only the necessary sustenance to serve God. His mastery over appetite was admirable, the result of long and constant mortification. Charbel's rest was also penitential. He slept little, often on a very hard bed, sometimes on the ground or on simple planks, with a stone or a log for a pillow. He would rise at night to pray, stealing hours from sleep to dedicate to God. He also wore rough garments of penance next to his skin and practiced various bodily mortifications, always with the moderation and discretion that prudence advises, to dominate the body and subject it to the spirit, as the Apostle St. Paul teaches, who said that he punished his body and enslaved it, according to his first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 9. This extreme austerity in Charbel was not born from a disdain for the body or an unhealthy rigor, but rather an expression of his love for Christ and his desire to unite with him in his passion. For him, penance held a deeply spiritual meaning. It was a way to participate in the sufferings of the Lord, to make reparations for sins, both his own and those of others, and to purify the soul of all earthly attachments. He did not seek suffering for its own sake, but rather as a path to union with the crucified Christ and the liberation of the soul to soar towards God. Charbel's extreme poverty and penance serve as a poignant testimony in a world that often seeks only comfort and pleasure. They remind us that the path to holiness passes through renunciation and mortification, through victory over selfishness and passions. Charbel teaches us that those who wish to possess God must empty themselves of earthly things, and that true freedom of the soul is achieved through self-mastery. His austere life, far from being sad, was filled with the deep joy of one who has given up everything for Christ. All of that penance was directed towards work and prayer, which filled his days. Chapter 18. The work of his hands in the fields. Charbel's eremitic life was not a life of idleness or mere rest, but rather a union of prayer with manual labor, according to the ancient monastic tradition. Every day, Charbel dedicated part of his time to the work of the land, cultivating the fields and vineyards surrounding the hermitage and monastery to earn his sustenance and to avoid idleness. For him, work was at once a means of subsistence, a penance and a form of prayer, as he performed it in the presence of God and out of love for him. It is said that Charbel worked diligently and consistently on the monastery's lands, sowing, cultivating and harvesting the fruits without shying away from the effort or the hardships of fieldwork. Despite his life of penance and fasting, he did not spare his strength in labor, but rather devoted himself to it with diligence. He saw work as a way to fulfill God's will, which had told man that he would earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, as recounted in the book of Genesis, in its 3rd chapter, and also as a means of serving the community and practicing humility. For Charbel, work was not separate from prayer, but rather an extension of it. If there is a mystery that occupied the center of Saint Charbel's life, it was the Holy Eucharist. Everything in his existence revolved around the altar, where each day he renewed the sacrifice of Christ and united with him in communion. His love for the Eucharist was the heart of his spiritual life, the source from which all his holiness flowed. Charbel understood that in the Eucharist, Christ himself is truly present, and for that reason he surrounded it with a love, reverence, and devotion that impressed all who knew him. The celebration of the Holy Mass was the culminating moment of each day for Charbel. He celebrated it with extraordinary fervor and concentration, absorbed in the mystery he held in his hands, often with his face bathed in tears of devotion. He prepared extensively for Mass, and after it he remained a long time in thanksgiving, not wanting to separate from Christ, whom he had just received. For him, Mass was not a rite, but the most intimate encounter with the Lord, the renewal of the sacrifice of Calvary, the greatest gift God could give him. Outside of Mass, Charbel spent long hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, kneeling before the tabernacle, absorbed in contemplation of Christ present in the Eucharist. That prayer before the Blessed Sacrament was the soul of his eremitic life. In it, he found the strength, light, and comfort he needed. It is said that he remained motionless for hours, his gaze fixed on the tabernacle, as if entranced by God. The Eucharist was for him a magnet that drew his entire being, the center around which his whole existence revolved. Tradition has preserved a beautiful prayer that Saint Charbel often repeated before the Blessed Sacrament, addressed to the Father of Truth. In it, he contemplated the Son of God, a pleasing victim to the Father, present in the Eucharist, and offered him his adoration and love. That prayer, which he particularly recited while elevating the sacred host during Mass, summarizes his entire Eucharistic piety and his faith in the real presence of Christ. It was while uttering this prayer that he would be struck by the illness that would lead to his death, as we will see later. Saint Charbel's love for the Eucharist teaches us where the source of all holiness lies, in Christ present in the Blessed Sacrament. Charbel became a saint by continuously drinking from that source, feeding on the bread of life and adoring his Lord present at the altar. His example invites us to rediscover the treasure of the Eucharist, to participate in the Holy Mass with faith, and to visit Christ present in the tabernacle. In a world that so often forgets this mystery, Charbel reminds us that in the Eucharist is the very God, worthy of all adoration and love. And alongside the Eucharist, another love filled his heart, the love for the Virgin Mary. Chapter 21. the devotion to the Virgin Mary. Along with his love for the Eucharist, devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary was one of the pillars of Saint Charbel's spiritual life. This devotion, which he had nurtured since childhood before the image of Mary in the prayer grotto, only grew throughout his life, becoming one of the most characteristic traits of his holiness. Charbel loved the Virgin with a tender, filial love, and entrusted everything to her, seeing her as his mother, his protector, and his guide on the path to God. As always, it is wise to receive these accounts of miracles with due caution, distinguishing the core of faith they express from the concrete details that belong to pious tradition. What is essential is not the miracle itself, but what it manifests: Charbel's holiness and God's closeness to him. The miracle of the lamp, beyond its details, speaks to us of a soul so united to God that even heaven gave signs of its preference, and that holiness, confirmed by signs, was concealed under the veil of profound humility. Chapter 23. The hidden humility of the saint. One of the most admirable virtues of Saint Charbel, and perhaps the one that best summarizes his character, is humility. His whole life was a continuous exercise in humility, a hiding from the eyes of the world to appear only before the eyes of God. Charbel never sought fame, the appreciation of men, or any type of recognition. On the contrary, he avoided anything that might draw attention to him and strived to remain unnoticed, living hidden in God. His holiness was a hidden holiness, just as the life of Jesus had been hidden in Nazareth. Charbel's humility was manifested in all his ways of living. He always sought the last place and the most humble tasks. He avoided conversations and relationships that could feed vanity. He did not speak of himself or his penances or graces. He considered himself the least and most unworthy of all. Even as a priest and a man of great virtue, he did not see himself as superior to anyone, but regarded himself as a poor sinner in need of God's mercy. This sincere humility was the foundation of all his other virtues. In the eremitic life, Charbel's humility became even deeper. Withdrawn from the world, with no witnesses to his penances or prayers, he lived solely for God, without anyone seeing or praising him. His virtue did not seek the applause of men, but only to please God. It is the purest humility, that of one who does good in secret, without his left hand knowing what his right hand is doing, according to the Lord's counsel in the Gospel of St. Matthew in chapter 6. Charbel practiced virtue in hiddenness, and his Father, who sees in secret, rewarded him. Charbel's humility was the foundation of his union with God. For God, as Scripture teaches, resists the proud and gives grace to the humble, as stated in the letter of James in chapter 4. The more Charbel humbled himself, the more God exalted him. The more he hid from the eyes of the world, the more he shone in the eyes of heaven. His humility attracted divine graces upon him and made him capable of receiving the highest gifts of contemplation. Without humility, there is no holiness, and Charbel's holiness was built on the solid foundation of profound humility. The hidden humility of Saint Charbel is a lesson especially needed in our time, which is so inclined to exhibitionism, the pursuit of fame and recognition. Charbel teaches us that true greatness lies in becoming small, in hiding oneself, in seeking only the glory of God and not one's own. His holiness, hidden during his life, shone after his death with a brilliance he never sought. Thus, God fulfills his promise that whoever humbles themselves will be exalted, according to the Gospel of St. Luke in chapter 14. And that hidden holiness did not go entirely unnoticed by those who lived with him. Chapter 24. Testimonies from his brothers in life. Although Saint Charbel lived hidden and always sought to go unnoticed, his holiness was not overlooked by those who lived with him, the monks of his community, and those who had the chance to interact with him. After his death, In the processes the Church carried out to examine his life, many of them testified to the virtues they had observed in him. These testimonies, carefully collected, allow us to know closely the holiness of Charbel as seen by those who shared his life. His community brothers recalled above all his extraordinary life of prayer. They had seen him spend long hours in the church and before the Blessed Sacrament, absorbed in God, with a recollection that impressed them. They also remembered his fervor in celebrating the Holy Mass, his devotion, and his tears of piety. They testified that Charbel was a man truly dedicated to prayer, whose soul seemed to be continuously united with God. His prayer life was the trait that had impressed them the most. They also remembered his extreme penance and austerity. They had witnessed his fasts, his frugal diet, his hard bed, his vigils, and his absolute poverty. They knew that Charbel treated himself with a rigor that many could not have endured, and that he did it without ostentation, out of pure love for God. His penance was not the result of sadness or unhealthy rigor, but an expression of his love for the crucified Christ and his desire for purification. The brothers saw in him a true penitent. They also testified to his humility, obedience, charity, and purity. They recalled that Charbel always sought the last place, obeyed without argument, was kind and helpful to everyone, and maintained an angelic purity. They had never heard him murmur or complain, nor had they ever seen him seek his own comforts or interests. In everything, he appeared as a man of God, whose sole aspiration was holiness. These consistent testimonies from so many people confirm the authenticity of his virtue, which was neither feigned nor superficial, but profound and steadfast. The accounts from the Brothers of Life of Saint Charbel provide a precious portrait of his holiness, drawn by those who knew him closely. They show us that his holiness was not a later legend, but a reality lived and perceived by his contemporaries. Charbel was a saint not only after his death in the memory of the faithful, but throughout his entire life, in the eyes of those who coexisted with him. His silent example preached more than many words, leaving everyone with the impression of being in the presence of a true man of God. That holy life was already heading towards its end, which would come in a manner as edifying as his entire existence had been. Chapter 25. The Last Mass and the Father of Truth. The earthly life of Saint Charbel concluded in the most coherent way with his entire existence, united to the Eucharist, which had been the center of his life. On December 16, 1898, while celebrating the Holy Mass in his hermitage, Charbel was struck by an attack that occurred precisely at the most sacred moment of the celebration. According to tradition, he was elevating the sacred host and pronouncing the prayer he loved so much, addressed to the Father of Truth, when the ailment that would lead him to death came upon him. The prayer of the Father of Truth, which Charbel recited while elevating the sacred host, is a beautiful Eucharistic prayer in which the Son of God is contemplated, offered to the Father as a pleasing victim, truly present in the Eucharist. That Charbel was mortally wounded precisely while uttering these words at the moment of elevation holds profound significance. His entire life had revolved around the altar, and it was at the altar, celebrating the mystery he loved most, where he received the blow that would lead him to eternity. He died, so to speak, in the exercise of his love for the Eucharist. Tradition has it that Charbel, overwhelmed by his ailment, could not finish celebrating the Holy Mass, and had to be assisted by those attending him. He was taken to his cell, where he would remain prostrated for the following days, amidst great suffering, which he endured with the same patience and dedication with which he had lived his entire life. Charbel's agony was the last act of his offering to God. Those days of agony were for Charbel a participation in the Passion of Christ, which he had contemplated and loved throughout his life. Prostrated and in pain, he united his sufferings to those of the Lord in a final act of love and surrender. Tradition recalls that, amidst his pains, he continued to invoke God and repeat the prayers he had often recited, especially that of the Father of Truth. His death was prepared as his life had been, in prayer, in suffering accepted for love, and in union with Christ. The faithful servant was preparing to enter into the joy of his Lord. The last Mass of Saint Charbel and the attack that surprised him while pronouncing the prayer of the Father of Truth are an eloquent sign of his entire life. He died as he had lived, united to the Eucharist, the center and source of his holiness. It is beautiful to consider that the Lord chose to call him to himself precisely at the moment of the elevation, when Charbel was lifting the sacred host towards God. His life, offered as a host alongside the Holy Host, was now consummated in the supreme sacrifice, and that agony would culminate, a few days later, in a holy death that would coincide with Christmas Eve. Chapter 26. Death on Christmas Eve. After several days of agony, endured with exemplary patience and dedication, Saint Charbel surrendered his soul to God on December 24, 1898, on the eve of Christmas. While the Christian world was preparing to celebrate the birth of the Savior, the humble hermit from Lebanon was born to eternal life, to behold face to face him whom he had served throughout his life in silence and penance. His death, on such a significant date, carried a profound spiritual meaning. That Charbel died precisely on Christmas Eve is a detail full of significance. Christmas celebrates that the Son of God became man to save us, coming into the world in the poverty and humility of Bethlehem. Charbel had imitated throughout his life that poverty and humility of Christ, and now, on the eve of the Lord's birth, he was called to be born into heaven. His death, coinciding with Christmas, seemed to link his transition to the mystery of the Incarnation, as if the saint were to celebrate the birth of Christ already in the heavenly homeland. Charbel's death was serene and holy, just as his entire life had been holy. He died in the peace of God, surrounded by the prayers of his brothers, with his soul turned toward the Lord. There was neither anguish nor fear in his death, but the serenity of one who has lived for God and is going to meet him. Like the righteous one spoken of in Scripture, who dies full of hope, Charbel entrusted his spirit, confident in God's mercy and in the reward promised to faithful servants. His death was the sweet rest of one who has fought the good fight. Charbel was buried in the cemetery of the Anaya monastery according to custom, without special honors, as befitted a humble monk. Nothing suggested to the eyes of the world the glory that God had reserved for that body. He was buried like one of the monks, in the simplicity and poverty in which he had lived. But God, who glorifies his saints, was about to manifest in an extraordinary way the holiness of Charbel, and soon wonders would begin to occur around his tomb that would astonish the entire world. The humility of the burial would soon contrast with the glory of heaven. The death of Saint Charbel on Christmas Eve crowns an entire life of fidelity to God. He died as he had lived, in humility, poverty, and union with Christ. His passage, far from being an end, was the beginning of his glorification, both in heaven and soon after on earth. For that humble hermit, unknown to the world, was about to be revealed as a great saint through extraordinary signs. And the first of those signs were the mysterious lights that began to shine over his tomb. Chapter 27. The lights over the tomb. Shortly after the death and burial of Saint Charbel, extraordinary phenomena began to occur around his tomb that caught the attention of the monks and the faithful. The first and most famous of these was the appearance of mysterious lights over his grave. According to testimonies, during the nights following his burial, supernatural glows and lights were seen shining over the tomb of the humble hermit, with no natural explanation for that phenomenon. These lights, witnessed by numerous observers, were interpreted as a sign from heaven, wishing to manifest the holiness of that hidden monk. Just as in the life of Charbel, the lamp had miraculously burned with water, now, after his death, supernatural lights shone over his tomb, as if proclaiming that there rested a man of God. The glow illuminating the grave seemed like a reflection of the glory his soul was already enjoying in heaven. God began to glorify his faithful servant on earth. The news of those lights spread quickly, and many faithful began to visit Charbel's tomb, drawn by the fame of the miracles. The popular devotion, always attentive to signs of holiness, recognized in those phenomena the hand of God, and began to venerate the humble hermit as a saint. The lights over the tomb were like the first announcement of Charbel's glory, the beginning of a devotion that would only grow over time until it spread throughout the world. In light of the persistence of these phenomena and the growing devotion of the faithful, the authorities of the monastery decided, some time later, to exhume Charbel's body, to transfer it to a more dignified place. It was then that the discovery that would astonish the world occurred. Charbel's body, far from having decayed, was found incorrupt and, moreover, exuded a mysterious liquid. The lights had only been the announcement of an even greater miracle, which would admirably confirm the holiness of the hermit. The lights over the tomb of Saint Charbel were the first sign by which God wished to glorify his hidden servant. He who had lived in the silence and darkness of the hermitage, seeking to hide from the eyes of the world, was now revealed by the light of heaven. In him was fulfilled the word of the gospel, which says that a lamp is not lit to be put under a bushel, but on a stand, to give light to all, according to the Gospel of St. Matthew in its 5th chapter. The light of Charbel's holiness, hidden in life, began to shine before the world, and the miracle of his incorrupt body would make it shine even more. Chapter 28. The incorrupt body that exudes blood and water. When driven by the miraculous lights and the devotion of the faithful, the monks of Anaya proceeded to exhume the body of Saint Charbel some months after his death, they encountered an astonishing phenomenon. The body of the hermit, despite the time that had passed and the conditions of the burial, was found incorrupt, meaning it had not suffered natural decomposition. Moreover, it continuously exuded a mysterious liquid, described as a mixture of blood and water, or sweat and blood, which soaked his garments. This phenomenon of the incorrupt body exuding a liquid made a huge impression. The monks cleaned the body and changed its clothes, but the liquid would spring forth again and again, for years and decades. The miracle extended extraordinarily over time, becoming one of the most astonishing signs associated with Saint Charbel. That body, which should have decayed according to the laws of nature, remained incorrupt and alive, oozing a liquid that the faithful collected with reverence. The Church, with its usual prudence, examined these phenomena over the years, subjecting them to study and verification. On various occasions, the tomb was opened and the body examined, confirming the extraordinary state in which it was preserved and the phenomenon of exudation. These facts, carefully documented, contributed to the recognition of Charbel's holiness and the spread of his devotion. The liquid that flowed from his body became an object of veneration, and numerous healings were attributed to it. Over time, as the process of his glorification advanced, the body eventually followed the natural course of decomposition, leaving behind the venerable remains of the saint. The spiritual significance of these phenomena is profound. The incorruption of the bodies of some saints has been considered by Christian tradition as a sign of their holiness and a foretaste of the glorious resurrection, when the bodies of the righteous will rise incorruptible, as the Apostle St. Paul teaches in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. The liquid of blood and water that flowed from the body of Charbel also evokes the blood and water that sprang from Christ's side on the cross, as narrated in the Gospel of Saint John, chapter 19, the source of grace and sacraments. The body of Charbel seemed to extend that mystery. The miracle of Saint Charbel's incorrupt body admirably confirmed his holiness and ignited the devotion of the faithful. That extraordinary sign, along with the lights over the tomb and the numerous healings, caused Charbel's fame to spread rapidly. However, it is important to remember that these wonders, as amazing as they may be, are not the essence of holiness, but signs that manifest it. The essence lies in Charbel's holy life, his love for God, and his self-giving. The wonders are merely the external reflection of that inner holiness. And that reflection soon attracted crowds of pilgrims to Anaya. Chapter 29, the fame of holiness and the pilgrimages. As news of the wonders occurring around Saint Charbel's tomb spread, the lights, the incorrupt body, and the healings, the fame of holiness of the humble hermit grew extraordinarily, and multitudes of faithful began to pilgrimage to the monastery of Anaya. Chapter 31. Beatification and canonization. After a long and rigorous process, during which the Church carefully examined the life, virtues, and miracles of Saint Charbel, official recognition of his holiness was reached. The Church does not take these matters lightly, but with the utmost prudence, verifying the facts, studying testimonies, and examining the miracles attributed to the intercession of the candidate. In Charbel's case, the abundance of graces and wonders, combined with the testimony of his holy life, paved the way for his glorification. The first major step was his beatification, celebrated in 1965 by Pope Paul VI, precisely during the Second Vatican Council. It was a significant moment. While the entire Church, gathered in council, reflected on its renewal and mission in the modern world, a humble hermit from Lebanon was raised to the altars, a living witness to the primacy of God and contemplative life. Amid a time of great change, Charbel reminded everyone of the eternal value of prayer, silence, and total surrender to God. The definitive step came with the canonization, celebrated on October 9th of 1977, also by Pope Paul VI. With this solemn act, the Church officially proclaimed that Charbel was a saint, meaning that he enjoyed the glory of heaven and could be proposed for veneration by all the faithful as a model and intercessor. Charbel thus became the first modern saint of Lebanon, a glory of his people and of the Maronite Church, and was offered to the Universal Church as an example of holiness. In the canonization, the Church highlighted Charbel's heroic virtues and the value of his testimony for the contemporary world. In an era marked by materialism, activism, and the forgetfulness of God, the figure of that silent hermit, wholly dedicated to prayer and penance, appeared as a prophetic sign, a reminder that man is made for God, and that in him alone does he find his fullness. The holiness of Charbel, hidden in life, was now offered as a light for all. The beatification and canonization of Saint Charbel crowned the process of his glorification on earth, officially confirming what the miracles had announced and popular devotion had recognized. The Church proposed Charbel as a saint and intercessor for all humanity. That humble monk, unknown in life, was now honored at the altars of the Universal Church. His feast is celebrated in the calendar, and his name is invoked worldwide. With the canonization, Charbel was consecrated as one of the great saints of the Church, and particularly as the saint par excellence of his homeland, Lebanon. Chapter 32. The first saint of Lebanon, patron of a nation. Saint Charbel is venerated in a very special way in his homeland, Lebanon, where he is considered the saint par excellence and one of its greatest glories. In a small country with a deep Christian tradition, marked throughout its history by trials, wars, and suffering, the figure of Charbel has become a symbol of identity, faith, and hope for the Lebanese people. The Lebanese love him dearly and consider him their celestial protector, their father and their intercessor before God. The devotion to Saint Charbel in Lebanon is extraordinary. His image can be found in churches, homes, businesses and cars. His name is given to children at baptism. His feast is celebrated with great solemnity. And the Anaya monastery, where his remains rest, is a constant pilgrimage destination. Charbel is felt by the Lebanese not as a distant figure, but as a family member, a friend from heaven always ready to assist those who turn to him. His presence accompanies the everyday life of the people. Saint Charbel, a bridge between Christians and Muslims, teaches us that holiness has a universal strength, capable of touching all hearts. The goodness of God, which shines through his saints, knows no borders. Charbel, while remaining fully Christian and Catholic, has become an intercessor for many who do not share his faith, and a sign of God's closeness to all men. His example invites peace, fraternity, and respect, and shows that the path to God and unity passes through holiness, and that holiness has manifested itself above all in the countless miracles attributed to his intercession. 34th chapter. The Heavenly Doctor. Thousands of healings. Saint Charbel is known worldwide as a particularly miraculous saint, to the extent that the people affectionately and confidently call him the Heavenly Doctor. Over the years, an astonishing number of healings and graces have been attributed to him, reportedly exceeding tens of thousands. Patients deemed hopeless by medicine, inexplicable cases, and desperate situations have found, according to testimonies, remedies through Charbel's intercession. His fame as a healer has spread across all continents. The testimonies of healings attributed to Saint Charbel are countless and diverse. Healings from cancers, paralysis, incurable diseases, ailments that medicine could not remedy. Many of these cases have been examined and documented, and some have been officially recognized by the Church as miracles in the process of beatification and canonization. Many others, although not subjected to official processes, are part of the immense flow of graces that the faithful attribute to the saint's intercession. The Christian community has recognized Charbel as a powerful intercessor. It is important to understand correctly the meaning of these miracles, so as not to fall into a superstitious or magical view. It is not Charbel who heals by his own power, but God who works through the intercession of his saint. The miracles are signs of God's goodness and power, which aim to manifest Charbel's holiness and lead people to faith and conversion. Moreover, the healing of the body is not the most important. The most important is the healing of the soul, conversion, and returning to God. Many who come to Charbel for a physical illness also find the health of their soul. The title of Heavenly Doctor, by which the people invoke Saint Charbel, beautifully expresses the faithful's trust in his powerful intercession before God, the source of all health and goodness. Just as in the Gospel, the sick of all kinds came to Jesus and he healed them, today the sick come to Charbel, asking him to intercede for them before the Lord. The saint, who in life showed compassion for those who suffered, continues to have compassion for them from heaven and intercedes for their healing. His charity, which knew no boundaries in life, now extends into his heavenly intercession. The thousands of healings attributed to Saint Charbel manifest the power of his intercession and the goodness of God, who uses his saints to aid humanity. But beyond the wonders, what these miracles teach us is to trust in God and to turn to him through his saints in our needs. Charbel, the Heavenly Doctor, invites us to place our trust in God, who can heal the body and, above all, the soul. Among all the miracles attributed to Charbel, there is one that has particularly moved the entire world, the miracle of Nohad el-Chami. 35th chapter. The miracle of Nohad el-Chami, the operation of the two monks. Among the countless miracles attributed to Saint Charbel, none is as famous and astonishing as that of Nohad el-Chami, which occurred in 1993 and is considered one of the most extraordinary wonders of modern times. Nohad el-Chami was a Lebanese woman, married and a mother, who suffered from hemiplegia, meaning paralysis on one side of her body, caused by the obstruction of the brain's arteries. Doctors had told her that there was no cure for her condition and that she would not regain mobility. The account tells that on the night of January 22nd of that year, Nohad had an extraordinary experience. She saw two monks beside her bed. One was Saint Charbel, and the other, according to tradition, was Saint Maron. While one held her, the other made an incision in her neck, as if performing surgery on her. Nohad felt the intervention and awoke startled. Upon waking, to her astonishment, she found she could move completely. She had been instantaneously and wholly healed of her paralysis. As a sign of that miraculous intervention, Nohad was left with incisions or scars on her neck, visible marks of the operation that, according to her testimony, the two saints had performed on her during the night. Those scars, which remained on her neck, became a tangible sign of the miracle, examined and verified by many. Nohad's healing, sudden, complete, and without medical explanation, caused a tremendous stir in Lebanon and drew even larger crowds of pilgrims to Anaya. Tradition adds that the following night, Saint Charbel appeared to Nohad again and conveyed a message to her. He told her that he had healed her so that people would see and return to faith, and he asked her to visit his hermitage in Anaya on the 22nd of each month and to regularly attend Holy Mass for the rest of her life. Nohad faithfully fulfilled this request, bearing witness to her healing and her faith. Her entire life became a living testament to the miracle that God had worked in her through the intercession of Saint Charbel. The miracle of Nohad el-Chami is one of the most eloquent signs of Saint Charbel's intercession in our times. The healing of an incurable paralysis, the operation carried out by the two saints, the scars that remained as proof, the message of returning to faith, all manifest the power of God acting through his saint. But as Charbel himself indicated to Nohad, the purpose of every miracle is not the prodigy itself, but conversion, the return to faith. And precisely that message, directed to Nohad, gives meaning to the entire story. Chapter 36. The message of Nohad and the hermitage of the 22nd. The miracle of Nohad el-Chami was not limited to the healing of her body, but carried a message that transcends the miraculous event and reaches all the faithful. When Saint Charbel appeared to Nohad the night after her healing, he explained the significance of what had occurred. He had healed her, he said, so that people would see and return to faith. The miracle was therefore not an end in itself, nor a mere personal favor, but a sign meant to awaken the faith of many and move hearts towards God. The commission that Charbel gave to Nohad to visit his hermitage on the 22nd of each month and to attend Holy Mass regularly has profound significance. The 22nd recalled the date of her healing, and the monthly visit to the hermitage was a way to keep the memory of the miracle alive and express gratitude to God. Regular attendance at Mass also pointed to the center of Christian life, the Eucharist, which had been the heart of Charbel's life. The saint thus guided Nohad, and through her all the faithful, towards the essentials of faith. Since then, the 22nd of each month has become a special date for devotion to Saint Charbel. Many faithful visit the hermitage in Anaya on that day, or commemorate the saint in some way, following Nohad's example. That instruction given to a healed woman has become a widespread devotional practice, keeping alive the memory of the miracle and the trust in Charbel's intercession. The 22nd day is, for the devotees, a special day of encounter with the saint. Nohad's message reminds us of the true meaning of miracles. They are not spectacles to satisfy curiosity, nor favors for personal gain, but signs meant to awaken and strengthen faith, to inspire conversion, and to bring hearts closer to God. Saint Charbel healed Nohad so that people would return to faith, and that is the purpose of all his miracles. Those who witness the wonders of Charbel are invited not to remain in astonishment, but to take the step of faith, conversion, and return to God and the sacraments. The miracle of Nohad el-Chami and its message continue to bear fruit in our days, moving many towards conversion and faith. Nohad, healed by Saint Charbel, became a living witness to God's power and an instrument for the conversion of others. Her testimony, along with the practice at the hermitage on the 22nd day, keeps the devotion to the saint and his message of returning to faith alive. But Saint Charbel's intercession did not stop in the past. It continues to manifest in our own days with new wonders that move the world. We will dedicate the following chapters to these recent miracles. Chapter 37. Recent Healings. Georgianne Walker. Saint Charbel's intercession is not just a thing of the past. It continues to manifest in our own days with new wonders, showing that the doctor from heaven continues to assist those who turn to him. One of the recent cases that has attracted attention is that of Georgianne Walker, a lawyer from the United States, whose healing was attributed to the intercession of Saint Charbel, and presented among the miracles recognized by the faithful at the beginning of the year 2026. According to testimonies, Georgianne Walker underwent abdominal surgery at the end of the year 2024, after which she suffered a severe infection in the lower abdomen. The surgical wound remained open, inflamed, and unhealed for many months, forcing her to change dressings every day due to continuous bleeding. Her situation was distressing, and she found no remedy despite the medical treatment she received. The suffering lingered without any sign of a solution. The tradition of the case recounts that in September of the year 2025, Georgianne received a visit from a Lebanese friend named George Issa, who years earlier had attributed his own healing to the intercession of Saint Charbel. This friend brought her a small vial of oil from Saint Charbel and encouraged her to pray, asking for the saint's intercession. Georgianne prayed with faith and applied the oil to her wound, and according to her testimony, she was completely healed, with a full recovery and no need for a second operation, much to the doctor's astonishment. This case, like all of this kind, must be received with due caution, awaiting the Church's judgment, which rigorously examines these events before making a pronouncement. However, beyond the verification of details, Georgianne Walker's testimony reflects the living faith of so many people in Saint Charbel's intercession, and the trust that the saint from Lebanon continues to assist the sick who turn to him. The use of blessed oil, accompanied by prayer, is a widely practiced devotional custom among the faithful of Saint Charbel. The recent healing of Georgianne Walker shows us that the intercession of Saint Charbel remains alive and active in our days, and that his reputation as the Doctor of Heaven is not a thing of the past. In a distant country from Lebanon, in the United States, a sick woman found a remedy, according to her testimony, through the intercession of the Lebanese hermit. The devotion to Charbel, spread throughout the world, continues to bear fruits of faith, healing, and conversion. And other recent cases, occurring in Lebanon itself, confirm the enduring relevance of his intercession. Chapter 38. Saint Charbel and Annie, Signs of Our Time. Alongside the case of Georgianne Walker, other recent testimonies from Lebanon have confirmed the ongoing significance of Saint Charbel's intercession. One of these is the case of Saint Charbel, a Lebanese woman born in 1987 in the town of Jezin, who significantly bore the same name as the saint. Racha was admitted to the hospital at the beginning of October 2025, suffering from severe back pain. Medical tests revealed that Racha had a tumor in her spine, a meningioma over 2 centimeters, which, according to doctors, did not respond to medication, endangered the nerves and blood vessels of the spine, and could only be treated through surgery. The situation was grave and the prognosis concerning, but Racha, a woman of faith, placed her trust in Saint Charbel. According to her testimony, the night before a new examination, she placed her hand on an image of the saint that she kept by her bed and asked for his intercession before sleeping. The next day, when the examination was performed, the result astonished the doctors. The tumor had completely disappeared, with no medical explanation as, according to the doctor himself, an injury of that type could not vanish without surgery. Racha's sudden and inexplicable healing was attributed to the intercession of Saint Charbel and presented among the recent miracles of the saint. Once again, the doctor of heaven had aided a sick person who had approached him in faith. Another moving testimony from our days is that of Annie, a poor and sick woman from Beirut, from the Armenian Catholic community. Annie, diabetic and suffering from serious health issues, lacking the resources to afford her treatment, had been a devotee of Saint Charbel before her illness. In a moment of great need, when her condition was alarming and doctors indicated urgent treatment, she turned to the saint while looking at his image, almost reproaching him with filial confidence for not having helped her and asking him to heal her. Shortly thereafter, her test results unexpectedly normalized, and Annie attributed her healing to Saint Charbel, being counted among those favored by the saint that year. The recent cases of Racha Charbel and Annie, along with that of Georgianne Walker, are signs of our time that manifest the enduring relevance of Saint Charbel's intercession. These testimonies, which should be received with due caution pending the Church's judgment, show the living faith of so many people in the Saint of Lebanon and their trust in his powerful intercession. Saint Charbel remains, today as yesterday, the doctor of heaven, to whom the sick and afflicted from all over the world turn. And all these wonders ultimately point us to the message that the life and intercession of Charbel convey to today's people. Chapter 39. The message of Saint Charbel for today: silence, prayer, and unity. At the end of this journey through the life, death, and miracles of Saint Charbel, it is important to gather the message that his figure directs to the men and women of our time. For saints are not only objects of admiration or devotion, but teachers who show us the way to God. And the life of Saint Charbel, so hidden and silent, holds lessons that are very relevant for a restless, noisy world that so often forgets God. The first lesson from Saint Charbel is the value of silence and inner life. His life as a hermit, dedicated to silence and solitude, invites us to also seek spaces of reflection, to silence the external and internal noise, and to listen to the voice of God. Without silence, there is no inner life, and without inner life, there is no true union with God. The second lesson is the primacy of prayer and God above all things. Charbel gave up everything for God, and in him he found the fullness of his life. His example reminds us that man is made for God, and that only in him does he find true happiness. In a world that seeks happiness in material things, pleasure, or success, Charbel proclaims that God alone is enough, that possessing God is worth more than all the goods of the earth. His life is a song to the primacy of God and the fruitfulness of prayer. The third lesson from Saint Charbel is about unity and brotherhood. His figure, venerated by Christians and Muslims alike, is a sign of encounter and peace in a divided world. Charbel teaches us that holiness has a universal strength, capable of uniting people from different nations and beliefs in the search for God. In an era marked by divisions and conflicts, his example invites peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, and fraternity among all men, children of the same God. The holiness of Charbel is a seed of unity, The message of Saint Charbel for today is, ultimately, an invitation to place God at the center of our lives, to cultivate silence and prayer, and to work for unity and peace. His hidden, humble and silent life continues to speak powerfully to the hearts of men in our time, often thirsty for God without knowing it. Charbel, the saint of silence, shows us the way to true happiness, which lies in God. May his example and intercession help us walk that path, and to him, our powerful intercessor, we turn to conclude our prayer. Chapter 40, Final Prayer, dedicated to Saint Charbel. O glorious Saint Charbel Makhlouf, hermit of Lebanon, monk of silence and prayer, heavenly physician and powerful intercessor, bowing before God, we lift our hearts to him through your intercession. You who left everything for the love of Christ and lived entirely devoted to him in the solitude of your hermitage, grant us the grace to love God above all things and to seek him with a sincere heart above the goods and vanities of this world. You who loved silence and prayer and in them found union with God, teach us to also seek silence and reflection amidst the noise of the world. Grant us a love for prayer, a hunger for God that no earthly thing can satisfy, and faithfulness to the Holy Mass and the Eucharist, which was the center of your life. Help us learn from you to place God at the center of our existence and to rest only in him. You who in life were a model of poverty, humility, obedience and penance, grant us the grace to imitate your virtues. Help us detach from everything that separates us from God, to become small and humble, to fulfill God's will with obedience and love, and to patiently embrace the crosses of each day, uniting them with the sacrifice of Christ. May we, like you, turn our entire lives into a pleasing offering to God. You who are called the Physician of Heaven, and through whose intercession God has performed and continues to perform countless healings, turn your compassionate gaze towards all who suffer. Intercede for the sick, for the afflicted, for those who have lost hope. Reach out to those in need, if it is God's will, for the health of the body, and for all the health of the soul, which is conversion and return to God. Be for us, as you have been for so many, a powerful intercessor before the throne of the Most High. Receive, O Saint Charbel, this prayer that we address to you today, and present it before God. Intercede for peace and unity among men, for your beloved homeland of Lebanon, and for the whole world, for Christians and for all who seek God, and for each of us, that by following your example of silence, prayer, and self-giving, we may one day behold with you in heaven the glorious face of God, whom you loved above all things. Saint Charbel Makhlouf, hermit of Lebanon and physician of heaven, pray for us. Amen.